All right, now I want to show you some of the things that are going to make your job easier when you're taking the bike apart to get the brake lines done. You'll see we took off all the body work. We're doing a bunch of other things here. The tail section doesn't have to come off, so your luggage, if you want to leave it on, that's fine. But you do got to take off the fuel tank and all that stuff up front. Honestly, it's a very straightforward job. It's not the worst of any bike out there, especially even for Yamahas. So all is well. But once you get to this point, here's a few things that'll make your life easier. Take out the battery. It's good practice anyway. You don't want to get shocked or fry anything, but you're going to have to take that out because you want to take this bracket off. 4 bolts up top and then 2 bolts down here. That guy comes off. Next up, you got the fuel tank bracket, 4 bolts. That guy comes off. Here's your breather from the fuel tank. Could just kind of snake that out there. This is the fuel line. Kind of already have it out of the way. It was up here. You can put it forward, you can put it on the side, whatever you got to do. Just keep in mind that will drip. So before you start to play around with it, you want to clean it out. This bike's been down for far too long, so there's no fuel left in there. There's your breather from the airbox. Just kind of move that out of the way. Now this harness here really makes it easier if this is off the bike. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to take off the first clip, which is going to be right here, going through this hole. It's one of those arrow guys. So basically, use a long screwdriver, poke it in through this hole this way. You're going to depress that one side. And then once you kind of tilt it a little bit to get it out, you could then use a screwdriver from the other side. That thing pops right out. Very easy. Once that's out, you got one of these guys. A little bit less fun to play with, but if you do this, I recommend that it's warm. You don't want to do this in January when the harness is really stiff. You don't want to break anything. That's going to make your job harder too, but when it's warm out, you can just pry this over. So you just want to pull that out. It's going to come out of this right here. This is going to give you a lot of room to play with the harness. Move it out of the way. You then have 2 bolts on each side of the airbox. Take that out. Already loose, of course, just to make this easy for the video. And then deep inside here, I know I'm not going to get the focus right, but you can see the band clamp up there for the throttle body. I believe it's a 4 or 5 millimeter. I don't have the tool handy right now, but you want to just loosen each side from each separate side of the bike. And then things are free at that point. Now you're going to wonder what Ducati engineer made this airbox, because it fits in here real tight. It's easiest if you do it like I'm going to show you here. If you play around with it, you're going to make your job harder. And the first time I did it, it was certainly much more challenging. So you just want to push down a little bit. You'll see that I'm doing this now with one hand. Okay, it's easier with 2. If you push that end down and then slide it up, kind of give it up here. Use the other hand. Give it a little twist. You see that I scratched up the airbox the first 5 times that I took it on, but if you do it that way, it's much easier. The factory service manual really doesn't cover how to take that out very well, so if you follow that procedure, it's much easier. This is what you're going to be left with for installation room here. Some of the stuff's already been taken off because these are the prototype lines, but I'm going to walk you through how the lines go on the bike, things to look for, and that'll get you to where you need to be. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how to get this thing installed. All right, now it's easiest if we show you what comes off the bike when it's actually off the bike. Here's the rear lines. This starts at the caliper, snakes on up to this bracket assembly, turns into a hard line, and it goes up over the engine, under the frame rail, and then these flex lines snake around over to the ABS pump. So you're going to take all this off, including this bracket. All that heavy steel bracket's going to come off. Same thing with this guy back here. This guy actually mounts onto the shock. If you really wanted to, because you didn't want to take off the shock bolt, you could leave this on. There's no reason to. It will get in the way if you're trying to work on the shock or something else, but you could leave it on if you don't want to. But if you take a few minutes, you could pop it off the shock and that all comes off. So all these components come off. This is the line coming off the master cylinder, a bunch of soft lines, hard lines, and brackets. All right, so everything here, you're going to take off the bike and you're not going to reuse. Now on the front, same thing. Here's the top line going from the master cylinder to the ABS pump. There is one hard line that's retained, and I'll show you that when we do the installation of the new lines. But all the soft lines coming off here, these all come off the bike, including the crossover line. There's a hard line actually, a steel hard line that goes over the fender, and two soft lines coming down to the calipers. So all these components come off. They're not going to be reused. Cut off the metal, scrap it, throw away the rubber, save it forever. No one else is going to want these things, but that's your call. Now, when you remove the brake lines, I recommend that you mark which lines went where on the ABS pump. Some of the older pumps on other Yamahas had markings on them, and it would tell you which line went where. This one's smaller, and they didn't choose to put the markings on it. So unfortunately, you're gonna have to do this yourself, but I do recommend you take some time to label them. If you mix these up, you're gonna have a hard time because the ABS is actually gonna cause the master cylinder to lock up instead of unlock. And you know, sometimes that could be a bad deal. So you wanna mark these closely, right? The rear one here is the rear brake. This one is the rear master cylinder, front master cylinder, front brake. Here's the hard line that I mentioned that is retained. You don't need to remove this, just leave it in place. That's gonna stay just like it is from the factory. Snakes over the frame, down around the radiator. It's retained by that factory clip and the factory fitting. So all this stays, you don't need to touch that, but obviously you do take off all the rubber lines, which we showed you before. Now I wanna show you what happens here on these lines. You're gonna start, get the camera here, you're gonna start by connecting this here first. Slide the grommet over a little bit if you need to make an adjustment. Get that clipped into place. Now the rest of these clips, you could skip these for just a moment. We're gonna come to those next. Bring the line down to the right side caliper. Install it here with the double bolt. You're gonna use the crossover line as well, so snake it over there. You may have to make a minor adjustment to the angle on these fittings, but they are adjustable, which is pretty cool. They come with a really easy to use tool. You could use a vise, you could use some pliers, but there's instructions. It's very straightforward. We actually have some other videos that show how that's gonna go down. So you could check that out, but you might have to make a minor adjustment. Get that bolt in and start working your way up. Clip into the factory grommet location here. And again, you might have to move that a little bit, but clip it into place. Take this factory clip, slide the grommet into place on the crossover line, snap it into place. You're gonna run this over the ABS line over the fender. Ensure that this is snapped in as well. You're then gonna come over here onto this caliper side, put the bolt in, make an adjustment if you need to. Add another factory clip here to retain the sensor wire. You don't need to do anything up here. This is exactly how it was from the factory. So retain that as usual. Secure with the clip. And this is how your crossover line is going to look. So then come on up. You should have all the slack out of the down line at this point. None of this line over here is going to move in operation. So you want to bring up your slack here and leave a nice bend. This is the piece that's going to move and compress and bend as you ride down the road. So you're going to closely align these grommets that are supplied with the kit, snap the factory clips on the sensor wire, follow your way on up, and this you just reinstall as it was from the factory, more or less. You're gonna be left with a nice little loop like that that gives you plenty of clearance for lock-to-lock turning. Certainly check that out before you tighten everything down and make sure that there's no binding, but that's how it's gonna look. All the pickup lines are gonna be held with the clips in the same locations. Everything will fit well. Make sure that there's no binding, nothing's hitting. Once you're happy, then come down and torque these bolts in accordance with the torque specs and the installation instructions. Don't go any tighter, especially if you're using a steel bolt from the factory. You gotta be careful. These are obviously aluminum, they're softer. You don't wanna cross thread them. That's your first problem. So use the torque spec, make sure that they're going in nice and straight, then torque it down properly. If you use our really fancy, nice aluminum bolts, I like them. They are a little bit lighter and They don't typically have the corrosion problem that this particular plating has after a couple years of use. But they're aluminum, so they're soft as well. And if you over torque them, you're gonna break threads or the bolt and you're gonna have a hard time. So always use a torque wrench. But this is how this is gonna look when it's secured properly. Now up top, this is our 2-inch longer line. So you'll see that it snakes over, retains a grommet in the factory location for the clip, runs down in that guard, runs through that other clip location here, snakes in the frame, over to the ABS unit, just like the factory. It's a little hard to see here, but I want to show that the throttle cables go over it. So the line goes underneath. It's a tough angle and I apologize, but that's how that looks. This is our 2-inch line. This will work with the stock bars. There's enough room here to kind of hide the extra slack. But this way, if you change out your risers or your handlebars, you got a little bit extra room to adjust things without having to buy new brake lines. But we do have the stock length line as well if you prefer that. So you got some options. But that's the front lines, stock replacement. Just as you'd expect with the factory replacement kit. All right, now onto the rear lines. We're gonna start at the ABS pump. Remember, these have been marked. Keep track of which ones go where. Straight fittings go to the ABS pump. They will be marked, but just a reminder. They're gonna snake underneath the frame, just like the factory ones did. They kind of float in that opening. This bracket, as I mentioned earlier, has been removed completely from the bike. The lines run underneath the frame member. And you're gonna see that there are 2 P-clamps supplied with the kit. There's an M5 bolt, a spacer, and a washer with a nut. The clamps are alternating around 2 of the grommets. You may have to slide those a little bit to get them right, but they'll go together. I move a couple things out of the way here. This is the factory bracket, still on the bike. Easiest thing to do to get this on and off would be to take this off the bike with that one mounting screw. I recommend putting the head, the bolt head or the cap screw head underneath, feed it up. You can use an Allen key underneath and an open end wrench on top, and that'll securely mount those lines in that location. From there, the lines come down. They are secured there with a zip tie to keep them together. And then you're gonna see another 2 sections of heat shrink and a grommet. That grommet is gonna nest right in there up against the frame. And you're gonna use 2 zip ties, daisy chained around the 2 lines, and then use another zip tie around this welded frame member in there. That's gonna hold it in there so that it doesn't rub up against the frame or the engine, and it's gonna provide clearance around the swing arm. And we'll follow these lines down. I'll go here to the master cylinder. This is the 90-degree fitting. When it's installed properly, it's gonna be up against this particular stop. That's gonna provide plenty of clearance here so that it's not touching the frame member. It'll touch the hose on the reservoir, but it's soft and this line doesn't move, so you're gonna be just fine. Factory clip is utilized here on that grommet. As you can see, factory clip, grommet on the kit. Everything fits real nice. Harness fits on the factory bracket down here, along with the grommet that comes on the line. You can get a good feel for how that line looks. I know the focus is a little fuzzy. There's a little bit of a bend here and a little bit of a bend over there. It's not actually touching the swing arm. You want to provide enough clearance there so that when the suspension articulates, it doesn't rub anything. And you also want a little bit of this expansion loop, if you will, so that when you take off the caliper on the back, or if you adjust the chain, you got a little bit of room to take up the extra slack. factory clip, factory clip, factory clip. You're actually going to reuse them all except for one. There was one extra one up here which is not going to be reused. So you're going to have one left over, but the rest are maintained. You're going to see here that these fittings, when you tighten them, you want to rotate this over. It's going to want to twist this way actually, but rotate it up against like your caliper, torque it down properly. This is going to give a nice sweeping bend for clearance so it doesn't stick out, and it's going to give that expansion room that I mentioned earlier for when you move the caliper back as you adjust your chain slack. So that's how it looks. It's very straightforward. Uses the factory bracket there. As I mentioned earlier, the factory bracket up off the shock is removed here. You can leave it on if you wanted to, but certainly cleaner to take it off. But this is generally what it looks like when it's installed. Just ensure you have good clearance. Everything is secure. There's no rubbing, no binding. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, use a torque wrench for these and torque them to spec. And of course, these have to be reassembled. That's what that looks like when it's done. And you put the airbox back on and your fuel tank, bodywork, and you'll be ready to rock. Now, something else I wanted to show over here on the ABS pump. This kit is for the rear ABS delete. So the two lines have been removed. You utilize our plugs, cap those off, and away you go. As I mentioned in the other video, it is good to mark these so that you don't mix them up, but it gets easier when you take off the rear ABS. So the hard line is what goes down to the calipers, and then this stainless steel line or the soft line comes up to like the master cylinder. So don't mix those two up. You shouldn't even have to play with this one. It gets very straightforward once you take off the rear ABS, but just wanted to make a point that those plugs are included with our kit, and that should be all you need to take that and go from there. All right, now here it is installed. This is the ABS rear delete line coming directly off the master cylinder, just like an old school non-ABS bike. And I wanted to show some of the installation. It's very straightforward, but when you torque this down, obviously it's going to rotate full stop over here. So that's the proper orientation. You're going to have these two grommets here, which are in place for the ABS sensor wire, should you choose to leave it. These two mounts for the grommets over there for the lead, and then directly back to the caliper. And again, when you torque that down, it's going to rotate automatically to the stop. So this is how it's going to look. Very straightforward. There's really not much else to share. Hopefully this helps make sense. Hardest part, obviously, is getting the stock stuff off the bike, but that's all gone now. So all that bracketry that was over here is gone. You could take it off. You could technically even leave it on if you wanted to, but if you could pull that bolt, it's definitely cleaner. You got more room, you save a little bit of weight. So this is what that looks like. You should be happy now. You can actually lock up the rear tire when you're off-road in the dirt or the gravel. Obviously, you shouldn't be stupid here. You don't have ABS on the rear anymore. It's not going to come on. So you could switch the front and the rear will always be off. So hopefully this helps you guys. If you have any questions, give us a ring, send us an email, or drop a comment down below.